Hi, in this video we're going to take a look at complex sentences with relative pronouns, and in particular we're going to focus on punctuation because punctuation for complex sentences with relative pronouns can be a little bit tricky. So what are complex sentences? Complex sentences are comprised of one independent clause and one or more dependent clauses. So independent clauses, remember, are independent because they can stand alone as a complete sentence. That means that they contain a subject and a verb, and they express a complete thought. Dependent clauses, on the other hand, contain a subject and a verb, but they cannot stand alone as a complete sentence because they do not express a complete thought. So they leave us hanging. And complex sentences either have a subordinate conjunction or a relative pronoun. So these are our two types of complex sentences, those that include subordinating conjunctions. And here's an example. When the fish ate the bait, Martina reeled it in. So here we have the subordinate conjunction when, and this is our dependent clause, when the fish ate the bait. So even though we have a subject, fish, and a verb, ate, the clause leaves us hanging, wanting more information. So it is a dependent clause. We also have complex sentences with relative pronouns. Here's an example. Email, which has been popular for many years, is losing its status to text and instant messaging. So in this case, which is our relative pronoun. It's referring to email. And this clause in italics here is the dependent clause, which has been popular for many years. So even though it has a subject, the relative pronoun which, and verb, has been, it leaves us hanging because we need to know what which refers to. That's why we need the main clause, the independent clause. Email is losing its status to text and instant messaging to create a complete sentence. Our most common relative pronouns are who, which, and that, and we're going to be focusing on those. So here are some more examples with relative pronouns. All cars that have bad brakes should be kept off the street. So in this case, that is our relative pronoun. That have bad brakes is our dependent clause, and that is referring to cars. We're talking about cars that have bad brakes. Next example, Francine, who is a police officer, recommends regular maintenance of brakes. So in this case, who is our relative pronoun? Who is a police officer is the dependent clause, and in this case, who is referring to Francine. Francine is the one who is a police officer. Another example, British Columbia, which is to the north of Washington, is very beautiful. This time we've used which as our relative pronoun. Again, the phrase in italics is our dependent clause, and in this case, which is referring to British Columbia. So what are the rules for punctuating complex sentences with relative pronouns? Well, the first one is that we do not need to use commas with that. Commas are used, they may be used with who or which, but because that is used with restrictive clauses, we do not need to use commas. So here is an example. The freshman did the homework that was assigned. So that is our relative pronoun. That was assigned is our dependent clause, and notice there is no comma. That is referring to homework. We're talking about which homework was assigned. With who and which, we have to look at the meaning of the sentence to determine whether commas are necessary. So, for example, commas are necessary when the information in the clause is non-restrictive, when the information is extra and not necessary to the meaning of the sentence. So these cases happen when we're referring to a specific noun or a proper noun. So if we have a person's name and that's who we're referring to, then we already know who that person is, so we are simply providing extra information, and we do use commas. So here is an example. Angie, who is a stylist, is very young. Okay, who is a stylist is our dependent clause. And who is referring to Angie. And Angie is a specific noun. It's a proper noun. We have the person's name. So this information, the fact that she's a stylist, is extra information. That means that we do need to use commas to separate out that dependent clause. So we have a comma before the beginning of the dependent clause and a comma at the end of the dependent clause. In addition, commas are not necessary when the information in the clause is restrictive, when the information is necessary to the meaning of the sentence. So this happens when we're referring to a general noun. So here's an example. Men who stay home to take care of children are more common today. So in this case, who stay home to take care of children is our dependent clause. And then we have to look at, let me get back there, who are we referring to here? Who refers to men, and men is a general noun. We don't have a specific person's name. It's not a specific noun, so that means that we need this information. It's part of the meaning of the sentence. If we were to take that whole clause out, take out that dependent clause, then our sentence would read, men are more common today, which doesn't really make sense. So we need that information, so we do not use commas, because who is referring to a general noun, not a specific name. So, a little bit more on this. If the relative pronoun refers to a general noun, do not use commas. People who study a lot receive good grades. So here we have who referring to people. It's a general noun, not a specific person's name, not a specific noun. So we do not use commas. Women who are vegetarian often eat too much soy. Who is who referring to? Well, it's referring to women. Again, this is a general noun, so we do not use commas. Let's look at a couple more examples. If the relative pronoun refers to a specific or proper noun, then we must use commas. Martina, who studies a lot, receives good grades. So in this case, who refers to Martina? A very specific person. It's a proper name, we have the person's name, it's a specific noun. So we must use commas. So we use a comma before the dependent clause and a comma at the end of the dependent clause. Last example on this page, I'm going to see Rita, who is a heart surgeon. So we ask, okay, who does who refer to? Who refers to Rita? Again, we have the person's name, it's a specific noun, a proper noun, so we must use commas. So we use a comma before the beginning of the dependent clause, and notice in this case the dependent clause goes all the way to the end of the sentence. So we simply end the sentence with a period. Let's look at a few more examples where we're going to try to figure out whether we need to add commas or not. So here we have this first example. Rosa Montero, whom I admire, has written more than 10 novels. So if we take a look, here's our relative pronoun whom, and that refers to Rosa Montero, a specific person. We have her name. If we have her name, it's a specific person. That means that the dependent clause, in this case, whom I admire, is extra information. So we need to separate it out with commas. Let's look at the next example. Authors who write every day are very successful. So we find our relative pronoun, it's who, and who refers to authors. In this case, we're referring to a general noun. So that means that we need this information. We need this clause for the meaning of the sentence. So we do not use commas. If we think about it, if we were to take this clause out, then our sentence would read, authors are very successful. But are we trying to say that all authors are very successful? No, we're only talking about certain authors. We're talking about authors who write every day. So that's why we need this information. We're referring to a general noun, authors in this case. So we do not use commas. Here's another example. I love to read books by Douglas Coupland, who is one of my favorite authors. So we find that our dependent clause is here in italics. And who are we referring to? Who refers to Douglas Coupland? And Douglas Coupland, is that specific? Yes, we have the person's name. So that means this is extra information, so we are going to use commas. In this case, we have just one comma, a comma before the beginning of the dependent clause, because the dependent clause goes all the way to the end of the sentence, and we end with a period. Next one, the novels that I read are often suspenseful. We find our relative pronoun, it's that. We already know that generally with that we do not use commas, so we don't need to use commas here. We can point out that that is referring to a general noun. So if we're using that correctly, we'll be referring to a general noun. So we need the information in the dependent clause for the meaning of the sentence, so we do not use commas. Here we have our last example. Beautiful and Dark, which is a short novel, received a lot of good reviews. So we find our relative pronoun which, and which is referring to Beautiful and Dark, a specific noun, a specific title of a book. So that means that this is extra information because we're referring to a specific noun. So when we're referring to a specific noun, we do use commas. So we're going to use a comma before the dependent clause and at the end of the dependent clause. In this case, notice that our dependent clause is inserted right in the middle of the independent clause. If we take a look at the sentence, if we were to remove this dependent clause, it would read, Beautiful and Dark received a lot of good reviews, which makes perfect sense. So this is just extra additional information, so we separate it out with commas. So the main thing to remember is that if we're referring to a specific noun, like a person's name, we do need to use commas when we have a dependent clause with relative pronoun. However, when we're referring to a general noun, like in this case with authors, we do not use commas.